Tweed salmon sizes, ages and run timing. Well, first of all, let us have a look at sizes through the year. Now these are lengths in centimetres, and you can see that from February to June there's a fairly tight size distribution, peaking at around 70 centimetres or 8 pounds, and these of course are the standard Tweed Spring Salmon. Now there are some variants there. We have early on a small group of slightly larger fish. These are the repeat spawners, around about 15 pounds perhaps, and then another small group of larger fish, which are the rather few 3C winter spawners that we had in those days. There's some mini spring salmon, and by May and June we've got some of the very earliest Grilse coming in at a really very small size, and also at a slightly larger size some of the earlier summer salmon. The difference between the spring and the summer salmon is that the spring salmon has winter growth at the edge of its scales. The summer salmon has started to have some extra summer growth after its last winter. From July onwards everything changes, and you can see that there are now two size groups in the distribution. We've got in the smaller size group, in yellow, the 1C winter Grilse, and outlined in black, the 2C winter summer salmon. We also have some mini Grilse in all these months, and every now and again some very large summer salmon. This 40 pounder caught in 2005 was still only a 2C winter fish. Mini salmon and Grilse get talked about a lot, but actually there's nothing new about them, as you can see from some of these historic records. 1924, for instance, was regarded as being remarkable for the number of exceptionally small Grilse taken, but you also get these mini spring salmon as well. Now, changes in sizes over time. Now, these diagrams show the size distribution in weight of fish caught in the past. So we begin with the 1870s. You can see we've got some very obvious 2C winter spring salmon peaking at around 8 pounds, as is traditional on Tweed. We've got 1C winter Grilse, 5 to 11 pounds. We've got a small group of 3C winter spring salmon, and then we've got the large 2C winter summer and autumn salmon up to 30 pounds or so. And that's pretty much the same as we go through history. You can see the same sort of pattern: 1890s, 1910s, 1930s. But by the 1930s we're beginning to get into the spring salmon phase, and you can see that the autumn Grilse are rather fading out. Those are the brown bars from 7 to 11 pounds, because when you have a lot of spring salmon you actually have rather few Grilse. It's like a seesaw: when one's up the other is down. Moving on to the 1950s, we still got the same basic pattern though, and that goes for the 70s and the 90s, but you can begin to see a change in the 90s, but it's more marked in the 2000s, because there we have signs of the spring salmon getting bigger, the autumn Grilse getting smaller, and really not much good news about the summer and autumn salmon. They're also getting smaller. And more recently of all, in the 2010s, you can see that that nice pattern that you could see in the 50s there has really gone. There's no longer any particular link now between size and age of salmon. Most frequent spring salmon weights show this. You can see that it was always 8, 9 and 7 pounds. Always 8 pounds, the maximum, the commonest, but now in recent years we've got 9 and 10 pound fish coming in as second and third most frequent. We now have a higher proportion of larger and older spring salmon. If you look back to the 90s, we just had 1% of spring salmon over 13 pounds. 2010s, it's 15% or so. But we also have a lot more small 3C winter fish as well as large. So although we've got of our 9 to 13 pound fish now, over 50% of these are now 3C winter. In the past it was only a tiny percent were that small. So as well as large 3C winter spring salmon, we're also getting more small 3C winter spring salmon. Now that's not something completely new. In the past, in the 20s and the 30s, they did record 10 pound 3C winter springers as well. Changes in runs. We can identify different peaks of salmon and grilse going back into the middle of the 18th century. So we've got two periods when salmon greatly outnumbered grilse, in the 1760s and in the 1920s to the 1950s. We can also identify periods when grilse greatly outnumbered salmon. We had one of those in the middle of the 19th century, and it looks as if we're just coming out of a recent grilse peak. So we had the first grilse decline in the latter part of the 19th century. Now that was followed by the rise of spring salmon. The obvious question is, the second grilse decline that we're seeing, will it also result in a rise of spring salmon afterwards? The reason we talk about the first decline in spring salmon is that that was a major cause of concern at the beginning of the 20th century. Now there has been a recent alarm about the decline in grilse, but actually we have seen this before, as shown in the previous graph. And we do have some evidence that the present grilse decline is being followed by a switch towards 2C winter fish. We've got ICES working group reports that show that from the River Bush, from Norway, from England and Wales, there are all signs of a shift from grilse to multi-sea winter fish. And the suggestion is this could be possibly due to poor growth in the first season at sea, making the fish stay a second. Now, one of the interesting things we can see in the Tweed is that this change in run timing can vary between different parts of the catchment. And we can see this by comparing the catches made at Boleside with the catches made at Fairnley and the Yare and the Nest, which are fisheries above the Ettrick, while Boleside is of course below the Ettrick. So the fact is that Boleside catches both upper Tweed and Ettrick fish, but of course those upper Tweed fisheries catch only upper Tweed fish. So by comparing the catch records over time, we can see what is happening in the Ettrick and we can see what is happening in the upper Tweed, two different parts of the same catchment. Now for these graphs, black shows fish caught before the 1st of July, the first half of the season, and grey shows fish caught after the 30th of June, the second half of the season. So we look at catches below the Ettrick in the 1890s, we can see two peaks, both grey, so they show both autumn grilse and autumn salmon, and there's no sign of spring salmon there at all. But if we move into 1905 to 1914, we can see, although we still have the two grey peaks, we've got some signs in black of spring salmon appearing. But above the Ettrick we have nothing but grey, showing that it's all autumn fish, and in the case there mainly autumn salmon, rather few autumn grilse. So there they are, the first signs of spring salmon. We move on to 1915 1925, you can see that there are distinct signs of a run of spring salmon, whereas above the Ettrick we've still got the grey bars showing autumn fish. So still no sign of spring salmon there. When we get to the 1930s and 1940s, we have spring salmon appearing upstream of the Ettrick for the first time, about 20 years later than below the Ettrick. We move into the 70s, a bit of a gap in the records there. In the 70s we can see that while spring salmon are persisting downstream of the Ettrick, they're actually disappearing upstream of it. And that brings us on to the present day situation, where we have a spring salmon fishery downstream of the Ettrick, but we don't upstream of the Ettrick. And of course another change that's taken place is that the upper Tweed has gone from being dominated by autumn salmon to being dominated by autumn grilse. So the key point, I think, shown by all this information is that there are no fixed points for salmon. Everything changes, sizes change, ages change, run timings change, so there are no actual baselines at which you can against which you can judge these aspects of salmon.